He had learned the sound of loneliness the way other men learned music. It was not silence exactly, but the low, constant hum of a house breathing with only one soul inside it. Elias Crow woke before dawn every day, not because he needed to, but because sleep no longer wanted him. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of Black Hollow, half swallowed by pine trees and time, its paint peeled raw by years of storms that had come and gone, without anyone waiting for them. 7 years had passed since Margaret died, yet her absence still pressed heavier than her presence ever had. Her chair at the table remained empty. Her coat still hung by the door because Elias could not bring himself to move it, and her laugh soft. Surprised, always ending a little too soon, still lived in the corners of the rooms like dust that never settled. People in town said he chose isolation, that he buried himself in work and grief on purpose. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The world had moved on without asking him, and he had been too tired to chase it. That night the storm arrived without warning, a savage thing clawing at the hills, rain lashing sideways like it meant to strip the land bare. Elias had just banked the fire and sat down with a cup of coffee gone cold when a knock cut through the wind. Not a polite knock, a desperate one. 3 sharp raps that sounded like a fist striking a coffin lid. His heart stuttered. No one came to Black Hollow after dark, not in weather like this. He stood slowly, every instinct screaming caution, and crossed the floor, boots heavy against the wood. Another knock followed, louder, urgent. "I'm coming," he muttered, though the words tasted strange after so many years of speaking to no one. When he opened the door, the storm rushed in like it had been waiting, rain and wind forcing their way past him, and with them, a woman. She stumbled forward, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with something between fear and determination. For a split second, Elias couldn't breathe. She looked like Margaret. Not the same face, not the same body, but the same eyes, the same haunted blue. "Elias," she said, voice trembling, and the sound of his name on her lips shattered something deep in his chest. He knew her. God help him, he knew her. "Clara?" The name came out hoarse, scraped raw by disuse. Clara Whitmore, Margaret's younger sister. The girl who had stood stiff and pale at the funeral, who had hugged him like a stranger, who had left town the very next morning and never looked back. Until now, he pulled her inside without thinking, slammed the door against the storm, and stood there staring as water pooled at her feet. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, like life had been unkind and relentless. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quickly, as if afraid he might send her back into the rain. "I tried the road, but my car—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together, swallowing whatever came next. Elias cleared his throat, nodded once. "You can stay," he said, simple, automatic. The yes words carried more weight than he realized. He gave her a towel, another blanket, set her near the fire. She sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, eyes flicking around the room, landing on Margaret's things like open wounds. Neither of them mentioned it. They spoke of small things instead, the storm, the road, the cold, circling the truth like it might explode if touched. As the hours passed and the wind screamed against the walls, Elias became painfully aware of her presence. The house no longer hummed with loneliness. It strained with something else. Tension, memory, possibility. Clara watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze heavy with things unsaid. And when she finally spoke again, her words landed like thunder. "I didn't come here by accident," she said quietly. Elias froze, the fire popping between them. He met her eyes, and for the first time since Margaret's death, the past didn't just hurt, it demanded to be answered. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them together in a house built for 2, now holding 3 ghosts, and a truth that had waited 7 long years to knock on his door. Morning did not arrive gently. It forced itself through the storm's wreckage in thin gray light, revealing the damage left behind. Broken branches, mud smeared across the yard, and a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. Elias woke in his chair by the dying fire, his spine stiff, his head aching from a night spent half awake, half lost in memory. For a moment he forgot she was there. Then he heard the quiet sound of movement from the kitchen, the soft clink of a mug against wood, and his chest tightened all over again. Clara stood at the counter when he entered. wrapped in one of Margaret's old sweaters, sleeves too long for her arms. The sight struck him harder than the storm ever had. She turned when she sensed him, guilt flashing across her face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I was cold." And I remembered where she kept. She stopped herself, eyes dropping. Elias shook his head once. "It's fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him. Nothing was fine, but some things were allowed. They sat across from each other at the table where Margaret used to hum, while pouring coffee, where she once reached for his hand without looking. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted her cup. "I should explain why I'm here," she said. Elias nodded, bracing himself. She told him everything, haltingly at first, then like a dam breaking. How she'd left town thinking distance would save her. How the years away had been filled with mistakes she couldn't outrun. How guilt had followed her like a shadow. Guilt for leaving her sister behind. Guilt for things she'd never said. And a heavier guilt she'd carried since before Margaret died. Elias listened, jaw tight, heart pounding because he already sensed where this was going. "There's something you don't know," Clara whispered. "Something Margaret asked me to keep quiet." His hands curled into fists under the table. "Don't," he said softly, but she did anyway. She told him about the night before the accident, about Margaret's fear, about the argument that had ended in tears, about how Margaret had suspected Elias was pulling away, not because he didn't love her, but because grief from his own past had made him afraid of losing her. And then came the words that split him open. "She wanted me to tell you. She knew you loved her. She just needed you to forgive yourself." Elias pushed back from the table, breath coming hard, memories crashing over him in merciless waves. He had spent 7 years punishing himself for words left unsaid, for fights unresolved, for a future stolen by a single moment of bad weather and worse timing. Clara watched him with wet eyes. "I stayed away because every time I looked at you, I saw her," she admitted. "And because part of me, God, forgive me, felt something I wasn't supposed to feel." The confession hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Elias felt it too then, not desire, not yet, but recognition. Two people shaped by the same loss, standing on opposite sides of an unspoken truth. Days passed as Clara remained, the road still flooded, the world unwilling to let her leave. They fell into a quiet rhythm, shared meals, shared silences, shared memories of Margaret that hurt less when spoken aloud. Slowly the house changed. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then real. And with it came the fear. Elias wrestled with loyalty to a woman he still loved and feelings he could no longer deny. Clara wrestled with shame and longing, terrified that wanting happiness meant betraying her sister's memory. The breaking point came one evening as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, burn gold across the wet fields. "I don't want to replace her," Clara said, "and I don't want to run anymore." Elias turned to her, eyes raw but steady. "Margaret isn't something to replace," he said. "She's something to carry." When Clara reached for his hand, it wasn't lightning or fire. It was warmth, familiar, earned. And for the first time since the funeral, Elias felt the crushing weight on his chest loosen, just enough to breathe. Love had returned to his life not as a betrayal, but as a continuation, messy, imperfect, and deeply human. The storm had brought Clara to his door, but it was truth that made her stay. And as the house settled into the quiet of night, Elias understood something profound. Grief does not end when love begins again. It transforms. It teaches the heart how to hold more than one truth at the same time. The days that followed did not announce themselves as important, yet they carried the quiet gravity of turning points. Elias noticed it first in the mornings, how he no longer woke with dread, sitting heavy on his chest, how the house no longer felt like a mausoleum but something closer to shelter. Clara stayed, not because the roads demanded it anymore, but because leaving felt like another kind of lie. They moved around each other carefully, respectful of invisible lines neither dared to cross. Yet every shared glance carried weight. Grief still lived there, but it had softened, like a bruise no longer tender to the touch. One afternoon, Clara asked to visit the place where Margaret died. Elias hadn't gone back since the funeral. The road was narrow, winding through trees bent by years of wind, and the air grew thick with memory as they walked the final stretch in silence. The small wooden marker stood unchanged, weathered but upright, flowers long gone. Clara knelt first, pressing her palm to the ground as if listening for a heartbeat. "She loved you more than anyone," she said quietly. Elias swallowed hard. "I know," he replied. "I just didn't know how to live after she was gone." Clara stood and faced him, eyes shining but steady. "She wouldn't want you frozen here," she said. "Neither would I." The words weren't a demand. They were permission. That night, Elias finally took Margaret's coat from the hook by the door. He folded it carefully, placed it in a trunk instead of throwing it away, honoring the past without letting it rule the present. Clara watched, understanding without speaking. Their closeness deepened not through passion, but through honesty. They argued once, really argued, about guilt, about fear, about whether happiness could be earned or only borrowed. The argument ended with laughter, surprised and relieved because for the first time, conflict didn't end in loss. The shift came quietly, one evening as rain tapped gently against the windows. Nothing like the storm that had brought her there. Clara reached for Elias's hand while they sat by the fire. He didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, fingers intertwined, neither pretending it meant nothing. When they finally kissed, it was slow, uncertain, and filled with tears they didn't bother to hide. It wasn't betrayal. It was survival. And as Elias held her, he realized something he had feared to admit. Loving Clara did not erase Margaret. It honored the part of him she had healed enough to love again. Spring came to black, hollow like a promise kept. The land softened, green pushing through stubborn earth, life insisting on itself once more. Clara decided to stay for good. Not as a replacement, not as an answer to grief, but as her own truth. The town noticed, of course. Whispers followed them at the market. Glances lingered too long. Elias braced for judgment, but it never truly came. Only curiosity and, from some quiet understanding. Loss had touched everyone there in one way or another. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Elias and Clara returned to the marker together. They brought flowers this time. Clara spoke first. "Thank you," she said softly, voice trembling but sincere. "For loving him. For loving us both in your own way." Elias added nothing. He didn't need to. As they walked back hand in hand, he felt no shame, only gratitude. Life was not what he had planned, but it was real, and it was still his. That evening, the house filled with light and warmth, laughter echoing off walls that once only remembered silence. Elias stood at the doorway, watching Clara move through the kitchen, alive and present, and understood at last. Love does not follow straight lines. It bends, breaks, heals, and returns in forms we never expect. He had lived alone for years, convinced his story had ended. But stories don't end when hearts break. Sometimes they begin again, on stormy nights, through familiar eyes, with courage born from grief. If these chapters touched you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, emotional stories about love after loss, second chances, and the courage to live again. Your subscription keeps these stories coming.